So, hello everyone. Uh, to viewers who are watching us, I am Somova Basu, uh, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation. I would like to welcome you to an interview by the CGC. The CGC is an international non-partisan forum aimed at tackling global issues that shape our modern world through independent research, analysis, and open dialogue. The major projects we have undertaken focus on international area studies with specific research interests on genocide, Holocaust, and disaster studies, international history and foreign policy, Cold War, and Third World studies. The main goal of this organization is to provide in-depth analysis, raise public awareness about pressing issues, examine the various crises of our era, and suggest peaceful and effective resolutions. So today we have the honor and privilege to have with us Mr. John Hudson. To introduce our speaker, Mr. John Hudson is the national security reporter at the Washington Post who covers news on the US State Department and diplomacy. He previously covered foreign affairs for Foreign Policy magazine and BuzzFeed News, and has reported from several geopolitical hotspots, including Afghanistan, Ukraine, Pakistan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Colombia, China, and Georgia. In 2008, he covered the August war between Russia and Georgia from Tbilisi and the breakaway of Abkhazia. In 2019, he was the finalist for Pulitzer Prize in Public Service with the staff of the Washington Post. Further, Mr. Hudson holds a BA in International Relations from Michigan State University. The US administration has recently classified a report on UAE's lobbying and meddling in US politics. Mr. Hudson is the first reporter who has reported on this classified document in depth in Washington Post. And today he is joining us to provide his in-depth analysis on the US-UAE relations in our session titled US-UAE Relations Prospects and Crises. Welcome to our program, Mr. Hudson.
Good to be with you.
So coming to, sir, as we were saying, so thank you so much, Mr. Hudson, for joining us. And it was through your report we have come to know about this meddling and lobbying, which has been going for kind of years, as the report has claimed. So, firstly, we would like to know that why had it been a sudden necessity for the US administration to scrutinize a country which is not an adversary like Russia, Iran, or China, but an ally like Emirates. And also, since when is this lobbying being going, and why is the administration suddenly being vocal about it now? If you could say briefly about your report and these things. Yeah, to you, Mr. Hudson.
It's a great question about timing, and it's something that I was trying to find out as well, because the reality is that the lobbying and the influence operations that the United Arab Emirates does in Washington have been going on for a very long time. And so what's prompting this? Why is this intelligence analytical hub, and this is called the National Intelligence Council, why did they take the time to scrutinize and deliver this report that was available to people with a classification clearance across the government? So that includes members of Congress and other people who work in the intelligence and diplomatic apparatus in the United States. Why did they do it now? Now, the difficult thing about reporting on this is that the spokespeople of the intelligence community do not want to give details and background. And so I did engage with them in reporting on this story, and I asked exactly the question that you just asked. Why now? What triggered this? What sponsored this? What we do know is there are several sort of recent events and developments that were covered in the report that are alarming for people who are interested and concerned that the United States might not be pursuing its own interests. And so, during the Trump administration, that was sort of the height of extremely strong and coordinated US-UAE relationship. You had a very tight kinship between the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and the UAE ambassador, Youssef Al-Taiba, and also, MBZ. And so basically you have this really close-knit relationship, and then you had those close to President Trump, including Tom Barrack, a longtime associate of Trump's, basically carrying out what many U.S. prosecutors viewed as a sort of dangerously close relationship with him, in which Tom Barrack would meet with Trump and meet with senior U.S. officials, and then share sensitive U.S. information to the United Arab Emirates. Now, the U.S. tried to prosecute him, but a jury found that he had not committed any crimes. So that is something that came to light recently. There are also other exploits in terms of you would have the UAE hiring former U.S. officials to conduct spying operations, including ones involving U.S. companies. And so that is more aggressive than the normal kind of lobbying that happens in Washington. This is the type of lobbying that we often think of in terms of funding think tanks, funding universities. There's so many think tanks in the United States that basically publish reports that are highly favorable towards the UAE and support the policies of the UAE. These think tanks range from the Washington Institute for Near East Peace, the Atlantic Council. There's also a number of think tanks that took huge amounts of the UAE money from the UAE and then have since distanced themselves, and it spans from left to right. So the Center for American Progress has taken lots of money from the UAE. In the past, the Hudson Institute, which is a conservative think tank, has taken a lot of money from the UAE. Sometimes in the past, the think tanks haven't been good about disclosing it. And so, you have scholars that are out there saying, the United Arab Emirates deserves to be the first and only Arab country to have the F-35 advanced stealth fighter jet that the United States makes. And those are think tanks that happen to be taking money from the UAE. And so it in that way, that's a very sort of normal, traditional way that foreign governments end up running influence campaigns in the United States, in Washington. But to be clear, hiring former officials to do spying, and in some cases breaking U.S. laws, that's the next level. And so in answer to your question, we can never know for sure what specifically prompted the classified report that the government refuses to talk about. But it is clear that there are so many events that have raised concerns that are covered in the report, that's what triggered it. And just to be clear with you guys, in order to do this story, I talked to 3 different people who have read the report from beginning to end. All of those people declined to provide the report itself to me, because that would be a crime itself in the United States, sharing classified information. So we're very upfront. We did not, come into possession ourselves of it, but we talked to enough different people, including a U.S. lawmaker, that we had confidence of the gist of it. And didn't face pushback in terms of how it was characterized from the top levels of the U.S. intelligence community.
Yes, and you're right. Like as you mentioned, that this report is not some kind of policy paper that has been done as a project from any think tank or foreign policy institute. Rather, it's a kind of information which the NIC, National Intelligence Council, have worked on and done this report. So yeah, I understand. But even if we consider the following, the lobbying and the meddling and brokerage, well, if we see from the perspective of United States, lobbying is not something prohibited, right? Unlike some other countries. So why are the lawmakers suddenly concerned about lobbying? So is it kind of to somehow restrict the brokerage, or is there something, some kind of bigger political picture in US that is there?
Well, the thing is, what the National Intelligence Council makes clear is that the actions done by the UAE go beyond just influence peddling and lobbying. And like the case that I mentioned before involving, the surveillance of dissidents, politicians, journalists, U.S. companies, these prosecutors helped the UAE break into computers in the United States. That was admitted in court. At the same time, all of those, the only thing that happened, those people did not serve any jail time, and they had to pay about $1.7 million to resolve those criminal charges. In the long scheme of things, if you look at how much those people were paid, it's not that hard to pay 1.7 million if you're paid millions of dollars by the UAE. So the concern is that all of the normal powers that the U.S. government has to regulate and limit and deter this type of activity haven't really challenged the UAE in a serious way, and it doesn't seem to have limited this behavior. The other thing is I'm very curious about. I don't really know if the National Intelligence Council would have done this under the Trump administration. We think of America's spy services as being the same under whoever was leading them. These are not political appointees. These are career officials. Maybe they would have done this either way, but there could have been even more pressure not to, because the administration's was so clearly close with the UAE. And I think another thing that a lot of people don't remember is that the most powerful person in the UAE, MBZ, he was very much a protege of Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince. And when it came to reassuring many thought leaders in the United States that the Saudi crown prince is actually someone that should be supported, he is a progressive, he is changing Saudi society for the better. The UAE and MBZ played a very important role as a validator, especially for elite opinion makers. There were columnists for the New York Times, Tom Friedman. There were a lot of people around Washington who were like, actually, these changes in Saudi Arabia are massive. And the UAE did a big part in laying the groundwork for that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you picked up the issue, the topic of Saudi Arabia. Like, I wanted to ask you, like, past few years since the previous administration, we have been seeing, we have been observing the US administration is more inclined to UAE than other Arab states, including the Saudi. So we have seen how the UAE has been involved in critical junctures of US foreign policy, and including defense and strategic policy. And so, yeah, so I just wanted to know, is this alliance some kind of natural, or Is it made to some? Is it made to do some kind of check and balance on Saudi Arabia, which has turned a little rogue towards US interests?
That's an interesting question. I don't. So, is it? You asked a few things there. Is it a natural alliance? I think it's very much a strategic alliance. When I was raising all of these questions to the United Arab Emirates officials, the ambassador Yusuf Otaiba told me that this relationship reflects common interests and shared values. But the reality is there aren't a lot of shared values when it comes to the United Arab Emirates and the United States. One is a democracy, the other one is not a democracy. The societies are extremely different. Now they do have some common geostrategic interests, especially depending on which president in the United States is in power. When it came to the Trump administration, who basically was zeroed in and fixated on the threat of Iran. In that situation, the UAE and the US were very much in alliance. They were both very happy pursuing a aggressive pressure campaign against Iran. This administration now seeking to have a nuclear deal with Iran, even though right now it looks less likely than ever. It doesn't exactly have the same interests as the UAE. Now, your question about potentially this being a way to sort of balance power or signal away from Saudi, I think that is what I don't really think that's what's going on. I think if that were to be a dynamic that was going on in the Gulf, I think what we're seeing in the very close relationship between the United States and Qatar is much more would be much more similar. Obviously, Qatar was had a much more adversarial relationship with Saudi and the UAE. And now they are very close to the Biden administration. Now that has different reasons. Qatar had every reason to get closer with the United States government after going through the very perilous experience of the blockade and the GCC dispute. And these Qataris have been doing everything they can to get in the good graces of the Biden administration. They evacuated more Americans and Afghan allies out of Afghanistan than any other country. Huge hub for that. We're very helpful to the Biden administration in the Ukraine crisis when it comes to liquefied natural gas swaps to help stabilize the economic situation in Europe. So I don't think that the United States is trying to pressure the Saudis by having a close relationship with the UAE. In many ways the US has a military base in the UAE, has a security relationship with the UAE, and what policymakers and even think tankers and others benefited from was that they might have been reluctant to take Saudi money because people have a strong sense of what Saudi Arabia is in the United States. People have much less of a sense of what the United Arab Emirates is. Average Americans, if you said UAE, they might not actually even know what you're talking about. The country has much less salience and understanding there. And so a think tank is taking money from UAE. People don't really see the scandal in any sort of way. If you say Saudi Arabia, this country known for advancing a very conservative form of Islam. That was the country where many of the nationals involved in 9/11 were from. People just have a much dimmer view of Saudi Arabia by comparison.
Yeah, it might be. Actually, why I picked up the topic of Saudi Arabia, because we have been seeing since the Trump administration, when the Abraham Accords was signed, we have seen like Saudi had some kind of isolated from it, and then which is Abraham Accords, which is one of the important aspect for Middle East during the previous administration, and also even to some extent now. But like we have seen how one of your colleague at Washington Post, journalist Jamal Khashoggi, was assassinated, which is a suspected pre-planned murder instructed by Saudi Crown Prince, it was stated. Uh, so we have seen that since then the United States had, kind of been in a had distanced itself from Saudi, and there has been some kind of sanctions, and then we have seen Saudi still towards Russia, and opening of gates for China, and the recent visit by Chinese President Xi. So we sense a hidden turmoil between the US and Saudi Arabia. So with this current situation, can the Abraham Accord be possible for the entire Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, the Abraham Accords is something certainly that the Biden administration is trying to continue from the Trump administration era. And I was traveling with the secretary earlier in the year for what the Israelis call the Negev summit, which is with all of the Abraham Accords countries. So we went to the Negev desert in Israel, and it's interesting to see all of these Arab countries meet with Israelis, and in sending top diplomats there in ways that they had never done before. Now it doesn't seem like there's that much they're talking about when it comes to deepening ties between the countries. Obviously, U.S. officials like to see this. They like to see Arab partners working more closely with Israeli partners. Some of the Arab partners spent most of the time saying that this alliance, these sort of meetings, this partnership structure is not a means of just avoiding the Palestinian issue. But clearly some of the Arab partners in the Abraham Accords don't particularly care very much about the plight of the Palestinians, at least the leadership, and so are happy to continue deepening ties and share with Israel a mutual disdain for Iran, and that's what's really binding things together. I've actually heard that there is going to be another Abraham Accords meeting coming up, but from what I've seen, these are not incredibly deep meetings. There's still a lot of issues that they disagree on. It's probably not worth downplaying, because it is, it's certainly a pattern breaking meetings, and for countries that have really sort of a hostile posture towards each other. I don't know if that answers your question that much, but that's basically what I've observed when it comes to the Abraham Accords.
Yeah, so how does Middle East see this Abraham Accord? So since you have been part of different tours, and you have been covering Middle East, so apart from UAE and Bahrain, we haven't been noticing much about this Abraham Accord recently, but there might be one upcoming, as you suggested. So what are the views, because it's really important, it's integrating Israel into the West Asian region, as well as it has the potential to solve many problems of the NA region. So yeah, so what would be your take on that?
The take on what?
So regarding how is the views on Abraham Accord for other Middle Eastern states apart from UAE, Bahrain, and these countries.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think the Moroccans are very supportive of it, and they've for a long time been very the sort of darling of the Washington community for a while, because of their strong support for their own Jewish community in Morocco. Like that's something that they often get complimented about in Washington D.C. in the United States. So I think there were some countries that had long been already comfortable with closer relations with Israel, and then beyond UAE, or Kuwait or Jordan. There's countries that are still not fully comfortable, so having their top diplomats meet with Israeli diplomats. So the Saudis are still holding out. They're not part of this, even though there were huge efforts in the Trump administration and some efforts in the Biden administration to get them to join the Abraham Accords. They're still reluctant, and I believe the sense is that because the leaders are being cautious because they believe that popular sentiment would still oppose closer ties with Israel.
Yeah, exactly. And like coming to an important factor when it comes to Middle East, when it's not only now based on like it's not only relevant for Middle East, but it's also for the across the globe. The polarization and the great power competition. We are seeing a kind of a global rivalry between US and China, and we have also seen a recent development in the Middle East, a new alliance named I2U2, which is a kind of interesting name, which involves Indian, Israeli, American, and Emirati partnership. UAE is part of it. How do you think this would be effective to counter Chinese influence in the region, which has been one of the more important issue for Washington?
It's interesting. The U.S. has had a difficult time getting all of its partners on board with a united sort of front against China. I think in terms of multilateral frameworks where they've had the most success, I think you would for sure point to the Quad relationship, where especially Biden administration officials are incredibly proud of organizing the first leaders summit of the Quad very early on in the administration, and having the Indians on board is something that they truly value and want to strengthen and deepen the Quad. In terms of other multilateral setups and how important they are, I think it's TBD. I mean, one of the reasons, and I'll probably be writing about this more in future articles, the US UAE relationship when it comes to China is difficult. It's very difficult. When I talk to senior officials about the controversial Biden administration decision to visit Saudi Arabia, which was especially controversial after the OPEC Plus decided to cut production. One of the things that U.S. officials would say, they would say, "Hey, like John, you shouldn't be too critical about that Saudi visit, because a lot of things got done that you never witnessed that happened behind the scenes." And one of the things that they cite is when the Biden administration came into power and they were getting caught up to speed on all the classified intelligence that's happening around the world. One of the things they realized was that the Chinese were building a base in the United Arab Emirates. And this was extremely alarming. And it was also it made a lot of longtime Middle East officials in the United States up angry, because they said, what is going on? Like, we technically have this very close relationship with the UAE, and behind our backs they're allowing a Chinese military base to start. And what US officials say is that during that Saudi trip, the US did a lot and convinced the UAE to halt the construction on that military base. So I can't speak too much for the newer multilateral framework that you mentioned, but needless to say, is the U.S. is still struggling and still trying to get some partners on board with that. And with the Israelis, it's hard to see. It's hard. I can't say that I have a super close window into how the U.S. is pleased or not pleased with their relationship with China. But a lot of our U.S. partners do engage in strategic hedging, whether it's with Russia or other countries, and they are certainly more interested in pursuing their narrow national interests. And sometimes that can mean, breaking with the U.S. over China or Russia or other, countries.
Yeah, and also if you see, like, it's not only for China. You rightly mentioned about the port of Jebel Ali, where the Chinese think it as a BRI hub, and they were planning to build their infrastructures, like, yeah, so, for their greater BRI project in the West Asia. But if we see UAE's foreign policy toward Emirati foreign policy toward the Russia, even after this crisis, we have seen, the trade has doubled, and even UAE still happens to be, one of the BRI hub for China. And I was recently reading that, Chinese officials are still in touch with, UAE officials on the Jebel Ali port, and it's not only for Saudi. Probably there might be, visits for, UAE again. So why is this? Even after having a good kind of partnership, the UAE almost, as we were discussing for the for the report, they almost, used its powers and sources and think tanks and everything to, bring US relationship to its favor. Then still, why does it, do, incline toward Russia and China when it comes to, partnership? Why this balancing act? So I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, well, I think that it benefits in the various ways. If you spent any time in Dubai, for instance, you see all the incredible skyline there, including real estate that has Russian money, Chinese money. It's important for Dubai to be like a place where and it has been a place for wealthy people from Russia or China to harbor their money, and it has created this tax-free haven of incredible wealth, but it's also been a source of concern for people who track money laundering and things of that nature. But that's helped the UAE, cultivate ties on all sides, and then they're by no means the only country that hedges and tries to have strategic partnerships with all the different powers. And we saw a recent example of that when the Brittany Griner prisoner swap happened. The trade for a longtime longtime Russian arms dealer, the Victor Bout, the Merchant of Death, in exchange for the WNBA player. The actual swap happened in the United Arab Emirates. So, there are different, the UAE is pursuing its own strategic interest, and sometimes that means having a partnership with Russia, with China. But obviously it's got a closer partnership with the United States, and it has to be careful not to go too far in one direction, or else it'll anger, Washington or the other partners. But it's not. There are many countries that do that, so it's not necessarily incredibly unique.
One important thing for, like, if we see from the perspective of Washington's policy toward Middle East, we have seen that currently it is having strategic partnerships and things. But when it comes to the formation, we mentioned about the Quad, which is a defense and strategic pact, which is between the countries of Japan, Australia, US, and India. But when it comes to I2U2, or even the other strategic partnership which the US is doing, we see a lack of security dimensions in these pacts. Like, these are mostly pacts for economic developments or trades, and these sort of beneficials for trades. But why does it for Middle East, when it comes to Middle East, why is US or the Washington, like a bit conscious about forming any kind of security pact, or focusing on the security dimension
within the Quad?
No, I'm saying that the strategic alliances in West Asia, like I2U2, these do not have security dimensions. So yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I can't say that I have a clear understanding. Obviously, when it comes to some of the partners, we do have a security relationship with them, like the Israelis, but why they're not using that format for security purposes, I can't really say. I just have to be honest when I don't have expertise on that particular topic, and I certainly don't.
Yeah, sure. We understand. Like, maybe you can later on write on the I2U2 and the greater aspects of US-UAE relations, maybe. Yeah, because I2U2, what we have been seeing, like the first summit, which people started to compare it with the some kind of Quad of West Asia, and yeah, even a scholar, foreign policy scholar named Mohammed Soliman wrote that there is a need for global, I mean a global Asian alliance which would be effective to counter China. And we don't know, because it's too early to predict. The I2U2 only had one meeting as of now, but is it possible to make a global West Asian alliance to counter China? Or
Yeah, I mean, you probably know more about this topic than I do, but obviously, when it comes to India, it's very difficult to manage a security relationship, because Russia is a key security partner for India in terms of weaponry and things like that. It's been a long time goal of U.S. officials to convince the Indians to be a closer security partner with the United States instead. But this sort of non-aligned status is something that is always going to, well, maybe not always, but it obviously looms large for the Indians. And that's probably always going to be the case, unless heightened tensions and heightened aggression by China, or a significant waning status by Russia takes place, and the Indians make a calculation that it's time to be an even a stronger U.S. partner on this front. And it's possible those things will happen when it comes to Russia. This is a huge strategic debacle in Ukraine, and the country. There's no question in my mind that the Russians are going to come away a weaker country as a result of this conflict. And on China, there certainly aren't any signs that Xi Jinping is going to be a more restrained and modest and humble leader, and obviously the conflict with India is it looks like it could only be headed for more tension at this point, but it just depends on those long time practices being reformed or altered. And I do think that generally from the U.S. perspective, trying to overcome that is a huge priority for both the Democratic and Republican administration.
Definitely, I understand. And we are almost at the end of our interesting conversation. So I just wanted to ask you, we discussed the crisis and prospects of US-UAE relationship and the future of Middle East, as well as the strategic alliances which is being formed in the West Asia. So, but the US-UAE partnership does have a positive effects, as well as with the as it is integrating Israel and and MEA in the region, as well as if we can see the crisis after this report has been done by the NIC. How do you think that what about the American dream of achieving greater Indo-Pacific? How can the US-UAE relationship be enhanced in achieving a greater Indo-Pacific framework, even after this crisis and the great power rivalry and regional problems of Middle East?
And I didn't hear that one part. How can the US-UAE relationship be what?
Be enhance the Indo-Pacific framework, greater Indo-Pacific framework.
That's interesting.
Because the Washington's dream is for a greater Indo-Pacific, so yeah.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the U.S. is trying to get out of their Indo-Pacific framework. In one way, they do try to stress, the freedom and openness and the rules-based order, right? And if there's one thing that the NIC report makes clear is they think that the UAE is not playing by the rules that they should be, and so if the United Arab Emirates are going to be, if it's going to be a country that is in service towards authoritarian actors in the world, for when it comes to the Biden administration, the Indo-Pacific framework is meant to, it's not going to be all about partnering with countries that are democracies for sure. They want to work with, countries like Singapore and other places that aren't what we would consider as democracies. So that doesn't mean that there's not a place for the UAE. There certainly is, and they want this to be a multilateral forum where they can stress commonalities and shared interests. But again, it has to be the main thing that they're stressing is playing by rules of the road, and not necessarily just partnering with anybody, including who the U.S. views as highly problematic. actors like China. And so, the U.S. obviously officially always says that the Indo-Pacific framework is not meant to put China in a box or whatever. But the reality is that it is. I mean, the Indo-Pacific strategy is about strengthening the U.S. and its partnerships vis-a-vis China, and limiting and deterring Chinese aggression. And obviously, from the U.S. perspective, if you're allowing the Chinese to make a secret military base, in your country, then you're not strengthening what it views as its goals in the Indo-Pacific region. But obviously, if the UAE goes in the other direction and shows a little bit more scrutiny and skepticism of China, the U.S. would hugely welcome that and see that as important. But it depends on how things play out.
So, Mr. Hudson, like my last question to you would be, in your report, I had read like the report has been this report on UAE meddling in US foreign policy had been taken by the US lawmakers quite seriously, and it has been discussed by the US lawmakers. So, what have been their take on this? And further, what is your opinion on the US-UAE relations in the upcoming times would be?
Well, the report did spark interests since we published our story. I have been told by sources that more U.S. lawmakers have requested to read the report. When that happens, the lawmaker has to go visit a SCIF, these rooms where you can view classified materials in a safe area. That actually is kind of a pretty big deal, because U.S. lawmakers, whether in the Senate or the House, these are busy people. These are people who are not primarily focused on U.S. foreign policy. And for them to make a specific trip to read a dense document, it is a big deal. So there's interest. I think it's some of the people that I talked to in Washington were very they were very pleased about the report coming out, because they said maybe this will have us change our laws related to foreign influence, related to giving the Justice Department resources that it needs to prosecute and cut down on illegal lobbying, illegal influence peddling, all of those things. So far, there haven't been changes, reforms made in wake of this, but it certainly is a data point and something that people are going to be pointing to, I think, for years to come, when they make the case that the United States needs to get more aggressive about cracking down on foreign influence. Your second question, of just sort of a broader question about assessment of the US-UAE relationship, like the US-Saudi relationship, it is coming under questioning and scrutiny in ways that it hasn't been before. And I think that the case that just always needs to be made is, how does this serve U.S. interests? It's not like other countries where there might be a lot of shared, a shared historic relationship, a perceived, community and like fraternal links and things like that. It's obviously hard to make the case for those types of connections, because that this is a tiny country in the Middle East, that there's not a lot. It's not like a lot of people have UAE relatives or things like that. And so what that means, that it really does rely on the strategic value that the relationship has. And a lot of people in the U.S. military community, who often refer to UAE as a little Sparta, they see a lot of value in this relationship, but others question it significantly because there's not a shared democratic unity between the two countries, and there's a concern that UAE from time to time is so aggressively anti-Iran that it doesn't make sense for the U.S. when at a time when the U.S. is reorienting its strategic priorities towards Asia, East Asia, and it's trying to get out of the Middle East, and it's trying to distance itself from conflicts that it sees as strategic losers. So that's I think the future of the relationship. Can the UAE make the case that it's valuable, but it's also possible that the UAE says, look, that we get all this scrutiny on human rights from the United States. Sure, they might have the most powerful military arsenal, and we like F-35 jets and things like that. But maybe it's not worth it, because maybe we're always going to be hassled by Congress that looks down upon us for our non-democratic system. I can't say I know which impulse is going to play out, but it's definitely going to be interesting to observe.
I understand. And our eyes would be also on the US-UAE relations. And as you mentioned that, it's very important that, US government now starts working on the cracking down foreign funds and this kind of, foreign meddling in US politics. We have been hearing it from quite a long time, but we haven't seen a bit actions. So it's time that US takes actions and on these things. And so thank you so much, Mr. Hudson, for joining us. It was great to have you, and it was a wonderful conversation. Your insights, as expected, was excellent, and it would be really great. And it was really great, and your research and your analysis would be an excellent opportunity for our organization's research purposes. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for taking an interest, and it was great having a conversation with you.